Aja Wilson walked off the court that night, looking more stunned than angry. Cameras caught her shaking her head, mumbling something under her breath that most people in the arena missed. When the microphones finally picked it up, it sounded almost throwaway. "I have a special whistle." 3 words. That was it. The kind of post-game comment you'd expect to be forgotten by the next morning. But it wasn't. Within minutes, that tiny remark started bouncing around on social media. ESPN anchors rolled their eyes and treated it like a sore loser's excuse. Pundits laughed about it on late-night highlight shows. The headline everywhere was that the 2-time champion couldn't handle the pressure and was blaming the refs. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than frustration after a bad loss. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. A few hours later, fans started combing through the box score. That's when the number appeared, the one that didn't make sense to anybody who's ever watched playoff basketball. Indiana Fever, 34 free throw attempts. Las Vegas Aces, 11. A 23-shot gap at the line in an elimination game. For context, this wasn't some early season scrimmage, it was the WNBA semifinals, the highest level of competition in the league, with a championship-caliber defense that had dominated all year. Think about that for a second. How does one of the most disciplined defensive teams in the league suddenly rack up nearly 3 times as many fouls as their opponents in the biggest game of their season? That single stat didn't just look strange, it looked like a flashing red warning light that something deeper was going on behind the scenes. Most viewers shrugged and assumed it was just an off night for the refs. But longtime fans and a few sharp-eyed analysts weren't so quick to let it slide. They started comparing Game 4 to the rest of the series. They noticed patterns that didn't line up, moments that felt out of place, and a sudden shift in the way the game was being called. On Reddit, the words "special whistle" turned into a running joke, but also into a theory. What if Wilson hadn't been whining about bad officiating at all? What if she had accidentally revealed something the league didn't want the public to know? That's where this investigation begins. Because once you spot the 34-11 free throw gap, you can't unsee it. It raises more questions than it answers. Did the referees really lose control of the game? Or did somebody higher up decide to rewrite the rules for one night to change the story of the series? In this video, we're going to pull that thread. We'll walk back through the earlier games, break down the hidden officiating pattern, and uncover why one offhand remark from the league's brightest star may have exposed a decision that changed more than just a single playoff game. Buckle up, because the deeper you dig into that special whistle, the stranger this story gets. It all started with one microphone, one sideline interview, and a moment that probably felt harmless to Aja Wilson at the time. After Game 4, while reporters crowded around the locker room hallway, someone asked about her thoughts on the loss. She could have given the usual safe answer about execution, hustle, or adjusting to the other team's energy. Instead, she smirked, shook her head, and said quietly but clearly, "I have a special whistle." That 3-word line hit the internet like a spark landing in dry grass. Clips of the remark popped up on X, TikTok, and Reddit within minutes, often captioned with laughing emojis or sarcastic hashtags. Sports talk shows treated it as proof that the defending champs were just bitter about being outplayed. Analysts on TV used words like excuses and frustration talking. Even rival players and casual fans chimed in online, joking that Wilson was inventing conspiracies instead of owning the loss. The moment felt almost comedic at first, a superstar venting after a rough night. But what really pushed it into the spotlight was how quickly the phrase "special whistle" became a meme. Fans clipped the audio, added it to highlight reels, even spliced it over footage of other controversial calls from around the league. Within a day, it was everywhere, fueling a cycle of jokes and hot takes that made it seem like Wilson had just delivered the sore loser quote of the season. But behind the laughter was a very different undercurrent of conversation. In Reddit game threads and smaller basketball forums, longtime viewers of the series weren't laughing. They were asking, why would Wilson say something like that at all? These weren't casual fans. They were the type who track free throw attempts, foul counts, and the tendencies of referees from one game to the next. To them, her remark sounded less like an excuse and more like a clue that something about Game 4 had felt off on the court. That's the moment the story shifted. What started as a quick soundbite for the evening news became the seed for an online investigation. Fans began pulling clips from earlier games, slowing them down, watching how contact in the paint was treated differently from one night to another. They started matching those moments to the official box scores. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Wilson's throwaway comment might not have been throwaway at all. And that's why this single post-game sentence matters so much. It wasn't just a headline-friendly quote. It was the first visible crack in the official narrative. A champion who had dominated the series suddenly felt the whistle was working against her. The reaction from the sports world was to dismiss her as emotional. But to a growing crowd of skeptical fans, that reaction only made the situation feel more suspicious. That spark, one player's offhand remark and the online buzz that followed, lit the fuse for everything else we're about to uncover. The numbers, the patterns, and the questions about whether Game 4 was simply a bad night for the refs or the first sign of something far bigger happening behind the scenes. In the hours after that Game 4 loss, the storyline practically wrote itself, and it was one the league was happy to see repeated everywhere. TV panels called it a storybooked upset, a perfect sports drama about grit defeating glamour. Headlines praised the Indiana Fever for pulling off the impossible. A battered team missing 6 players, including rookie sensation and national ratings magnet Caitlin Clark, surviving on heart and teamwork alone to steal a crucial win against the 2-time defending champion Las Vegas Aces.
It was the kind of narrative that feels good to believe. The scrappy underdog rising up in the face of adversity, the wounded roster clawing for respect, the team rallying around the mantra of "we over me." Sports fans love that arc. It's David versus Goliath dressed in modern uniforms. But a neat underdog story works even better if it has a villain. That role fell, almost overnight, to A'ja Wilson and her coach Becky Hammon. Commentators framed them as entitled champions who couldn't accept that the game had changed. Clips of Hammon pacing the sideline and arguing calls were looped on highlight shows to make her look like she was unraveling. Wilson's special whistle remark was replayed on every broadcast, usually stripped of context and delivered with a laugh track tone. The image of a superstar throwing shade because she couldn't handle the moment. By the next morning, the story had solidified. The Fever were the gutsy heroes. The Aces were the sore losers. It was a clean headline, an easy hook for talk shows and sports pages. It didn't require deep analysis, just the sort of quick-fire sound bites that keep debate shows running. That version of the story made for good TV, but it also did something subtler. It distracted everyone from looking too closely at the numbers hiding in the box score. While fans argued about Wilson's attitude, almost no one on mainstream panels mentioned the free throw disparity that had ballooned to 34 attempts for Indiana and just 11 for Las Vegas. The official narrative was tidy, emotional, and easy to digest, exactly what keeps casual fans engaged. And that's what makes it so effective as misdirection. Because the more people focused on personalities, the less attention they gave to a statistical anomaly that simply didn't fit the fairy tale. That disconnect between the headline story and the hidden math is where this investigation starts to peel back the surface. Because once you zoom out from the feel-good underdog script and stare at the numbers on the stat sheet, the whole thing stops feeling like a miracle comeback and starts to look like something else entirely. When the final buzzer sounded in Game 4, most people were still caught up in the shock of the upset. Indiana's players were mobbing each other at midcourt, fans were chanting, and the cameras focused on the celebration. But buried on the bottom line of the stat sheet was a number that didn't match the story unfolding on screen. The free throw totals told a different tale entirely. Indiana Fever, 34 attempts. Las Vegas Aces, 11. A 23-shot gap at the foul line. That's not just a blip. That's the kind of swing that decides playoff games. For comparison, in the 3 games before this one, the gap between the two teams at the line had never been more than a handful of shots. Suddenly, in the highest pressure moment of the series, the defending champions were called for nearly triple the fouls they'd been whistled for in any previous game. To most casual fans, free throws don't feel as dramatic as dunks or buzzer beaters, so the numbers barely registered. But for anyone who's followed postseason basketball for years, that stat jumped off the page like a siren. Championship-caliber teams don't just forget how to defend without fouling overnight, especially not the Aces, who had built their dynasty on disciplined, physical defense. That's why message boards lit up as soon as the box score hit the web. Fans who had rewatched the first 3 games started posting side-by-side comparisons. Identical plays that went uncalled earlier in the series were suddenly drawing whistles in Game 4. They weren't pointing to a single missed call or one bad quarter. They were noticing a full game shift in what the referees were willing to let slide. The questions came fast. Did the Aces really get that sloppy? Did the Fever suddenly transform into masters of drawing contact? Or had something about the way the game was being called changed overnight? What made the disparity even harder to explain was the style of the two teams. Indiana's roster was known for its disciplined drive and kick offense, aggressive at the rim, but usually not reckless. Las Vegas thrived on controlled physicality, bumping cutters, muscling for position, wearing opponents down in the paint. Those tendencies hadn't changed in the first 3 games. So why did the same style of play that it worked all series suddenly rack up foul after foul in the 4th? That single stat line, 34-11, became the loose thread that threatened to unravel the pretty underdog story. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing on its own, but it was too dramatic to ignore. And the deeper fans dug, the more the gap looked less like a coincidence and more like the result of something deliberate.
By the time the debate made its way onto Reddit and late-night sports podcasts, it had stopped being just about Wilson's comment. It had become a full-on mystery. What changed between Game 3 and Game 4 that turned a defending champion's biggest strength into a liability? To understand why Game 4 felt so strange, you have to rewind the tape to the first 3 games of the series. For weeks before the controversy ever began, the Aces had been allowed to play their trademark brand of basketball. Physical, bruising, almost old-school defense that leaned on body-to-body contact and hard box-outs. Fans of Las Vegas called it toughness. Opposing teams sometimes called it bullying. But either way, it was the identity that had carried the defending champions through 2 titles. And until Game 4, the referees had mostly let them get away with it. You can see it most clearly in one clip that's been passed around online. Indiana's Lexi Hall sets a routine down screen on A'ja Wilson. Hall plants her feet, bracing for contact the way you're taught in every fundamentals camp. Wilson lowers a shoulder and with one powerful shove, sends Hall tumbling to the floor. A referee is standing less than 10 feet away with a clear line of sight. The whistle stays silent. The play goes on as if nothing happened. That moment wasn't an outlier. Throughout games 1, 2, and 3, fans noticed the same pattern. Las Vegas defenders could bump cutters off their routes, ride shooters over screens, and fight for position in the paint with their hands and hips without being penalized. When Indiana players tried similar tactics on the other end, the whistle often came almost immediately. People started calling it the champion's cushion, the unspoken benefit of the doubt that star teams often get in high-stakes series. Stat sheets from those games back it up. In each of the first 3 matchups, the Aces either led or stayed nearly even in free throw attempts, despite being the more aggressive defensive team. Indiana, known for driving to the rim, rarely got rewarded with the calls they expected. Analysts chalked it up to playoff basketball, the refs letting them play. So imagine the shock in Game 4 when that unspoken understanding seemed to evaporate overnight. The same hand checks that had been shrugged off earlier were suddenly called as fouls. The bumps that once counted as tough defense now sent Fever players straight to the line. From the players' perspective, it must have felt as if the rulebook itself had changed between one game and the next. That historical context is the key to why Wilson's frustration boiled over. She wasn't reacting to one bad night of whistles. She was reacting to a complete reversal of the officiating climate she'd been competing in all series. From her point of view, the game had been flipped upside down, and no one had told the defending champs that the standard had changed. Understanding this pattern is critical because it sets the stage for the most controversial theory that would soon surface: that this shift wasn't a random accident or an outbreak of sloppy officiating, but something planned, a strategic decision designed to steer the series in a different direction. The deeper fans dug into the footage, the less it looked like a random officiating swing. By the time Game 4 was over, a new theory began spreading across forums and late-night podcasts, one that suggested the change wasn't a mistake at all, but the result of a quiet nudge from the very top of the league. According to these discussions, nothing as dramatic as a written order saying "rig the game for Indiana" ever existed. No secret memo with bold red letters. Instead, the theory centers on something far more subtle, and in many ways far more believable. That before the ball was tipped for Game 4, the league office told the referees to call the game strictly by the book. On paper, that sounds fair. What could be more neutral than simply enforcing the rules as they're written? But in reality, it was a move that changed everything. For 3 games, the Aces had grown comfortable with a style of defense that relied on constant contact. They had been allowed to bump, hold, and push because officials had been letting both sides play a rougher brand of postseason basketball. Indiana, meanwhile, had been trying to drive to the basket and draw contact that rarely got called. The alleged directive flipped that balance in an instant. By instructing the referees to tighten up and whistle every hand check, every shove off the block, every bump on a drive to the rim, the league didn't have to invent phantom fouls. All it had to do was remove the unofficial leniency that had protected the Aces all series long. What had been their greatest defensive weapon, physicality, suddenly became their greatest liability. To the Fever, the change felt like long overdue justice. Players like Aaliyah Boston, who had spent 3 games getting hacked without calls, were suddenly rewarded with trips to the free throw line for the same drives. To the Aces, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under them. The style of play that had carried them to back-to-back championships was now being penalized at every turn. From a business standpoint, the rumored directive made perfect sense. By enforcing the rulebook in the elimination game, the league could give the underdog Fever a fairer shot and in the process create the possibility of a dramatic, televised winner-take-all Game 5. The beauty of the strategy was that it left no obvious evidence. No new rules, no tampered stats, just a sudden insistence on calling every foul exactly as written.
This theory began to explain what no highlight reel could. Why a disciplined championship defense suddenly looked undisciplined, and why the free throw numbers exploded for Indiana without any visible change in their offensive strategy. Whether the directive was real or just a rumor, the players' reactions on the floor tell their own story. Becky Hammon's normally cool composure unraveled. A'ja Wilson, stunned and confused, hinted at a special whistle. To them, the game they knew had been rewritten overnight. And if this theory holds even a grain of truth, it would mean the outcome of Game 4 wasn't just shaped by the athletes on the court. It was quietly steered by a decision made behind closed doors. If the alleged directive was invisible to the audience at home, it wasn't invisible to the players on the court. From the opening minutes of Game 4, the Aces looked unsettled. Their usual defensive swagger, body-to-body bumps on cuts, chest-to-chest wall-ups in the paint, started drawing whistles they'd never heard in the first 3 games. Each shrill blast seemed to chip away at their rhythm, and by the second quarter, the frustration was written on every face sitting on the Las Vegas bench. No one wore that frustration more visibly than head coach Becky Hammon. Known for her cool, almost stoic sideline presence, Hammon had built a reputation as the kind of coach who could adjust mid-game without letting emotion cloud her judgment. But that night was different. Every new foul call felt like an ambush. Midway through the third quarter, in a pivotal sequence, she burned a timeout she didn't have, an almost unthinkable mental lapse for a coach of her experience. The mistake handed Indiana a free technical foul shot and an extra possession in a game that was still hanging in the balance. You could see the disbelief on Hammon's face as she realized what she'd done. It wasn't just about the point they'd given up. It was about the feeling that the ground rules had shifted beneath her feet. For a team that had been allowed to play a certain way for 3 straight games, suddenly every possession felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. The post-game press conference painted an even clearer picture of that frustration. Normally, Hammon is willing, almost eager, to break down strategy for reporters, rotations, defensive switches, the chess match of playoff basketball. But when asked that night about the flow of the game, she didn't offer analysis. She barely offered words at all. She stared at the podium for a moment and then muttered 2 clipped words. "Next question." That wasn't the voice of a coach who believed her team had simply been out-hustled. That was the voice of someone convinced the game itself had been taken out of her hands. For A'ja Wilson, the frustration was quieter, but no less telling. In front of cameras, she stayed on message, talking about needing to defend better, about effort and focus, doing her best to protect her brand as the face of the league. But in the raw clips caught courtside and in the locker room scrum, the mask slipped. At one point, she let out a small, sharp laugh and said a single word: "Interesting." When pressed, she quickly added, "I can't really say anything. I've got a brand to protect." Those 2 moments, Hammon's timeout blunder and Wilson's guarded remark, became symbols of a team that felt ambushed by a game that no longer played by the rules they thought they knew. And that is where the trap closed. By publicly questioning the whistle, even obliquely, Wilson walked straight into a narrative that was already being written without her. Instead of the conversation focusing on the sudden officiating shift, social media cast her as the villain, the star who couldn't take the loss, the crybaby MVP making excuses. Any attempt to point out the officiating swing would have required admitting that the Aces had benefited from softer calls in earlier games, something no player or coach could say aloud without inviting fines and even harsher criticism. In trying to defend herself, Wilson lost control of the story. The league got the drama of a tied-up series heading into Game 5, and the backlash that might have landed on officiating or league management instead landed squarely on the Aces' biggest star. That's the brilliance and the cruelty of the situation. The very people who felt blindsided on the court were turned into the public face of the problem. When you strip away the highlight reels and the sound bites, professional sports have always been about 2 things: competition and business. The competition lives on the court, but the business thrives in the stories that keep people glued to their screens. That's why so many longtime fans insist, if you want to understand the strangest decisions in sports, you don't follow the scoreboard, you follow the storylines and the money.
But a dramatic underdog story, that's television gold. A depleted Indiana Fever roster, playing without its brightest star, clawing its way back to force a winner-take-all Game 5 against the defending champions, That's the kind of plot twist that sports networks can tease all week. It's the narrative that turns casual channel surfers into live viewers and boosts ad revenue overnight. It also fit neatly into the league's broader marketing needs. The WNBA had spent months capitalizing on the Caitlin Clark effect, drawing in millions of new fans and breaking regular season ratings records. With Clark out, the league urgently needed a fresh headline to keep that surge of attention alive. A comeback series featuring the battered Fever against the so-called Evil Empire Aces was exactly the sort of headline that could keep those new viewers tuned in. If you look at it from that angle, the alleged officiating shift starts to seem less like sabotage and more like stage direction, an attempt to keep the story alive for one more chapter. A Game 5 isn't just another night on the schedule, it's a premium television event that pulls in bigger sponsors, sells more tickets, and keeps national sports shows talking about the league for several extra days. The risk, of course, was enormous. By shifting the officiating balance, intentionally or not, the league gambled with the trust of its players and its most loyal fans. But from a business standpoint, the temptation was obvious. Drama drives revenue, and a tied series promised drama in spades. This is why so many fans believed the decision wasn't purely about fairness or rule enforcement. It was about keeping the season's momentum alive. By choosing the storyline over consistency, the league set the stage for one of the most talked about playoff twists in recent memory. And at the same time, it set up A'ja Wilson and the Aces as the perfect foil, the villains in someone else's redemption story. Whether you see it as shrewd marketing or a breach of competitive integrity depends on how you think sports should be run. But one thing is clear. For a league trying to expand its audience and make every playoff game a headline, the lure of a Game 5 was simply too strong to resist. If the Aces felt blindsided on the court, the real storm hit them once the final buzzer had sounded. By the time A'ja Wilson's press conference clips hit social media, the storyline was already spinning beyond her control. Within hours, hashtags like Crybaby MVP and Special Whistle were trending on X and TikTok. Memes flooded timelines, Wilson's frustrated expression pasted over cartoon whistles, video edits of her interesting comment looped with laugh track audio. What had begun as a serious question about officiating had been reduced to a running punchline. Online, she was no longer the league's MVP, she was the villain of the week. Coach Becky Hammon didn't escape it either. Clips of her slamming her clipboard, arguing with refs, and muttering "next question" at the podium were looped over and over to paint her as a coach coming unglued. The team that had set the standard for composure was now cast as whiny, entitled, and unraveling under pressure. The most striking part of the backlash was how effectively it shielded the league itself. Instead of scrutinizing the 34-11 free throw gap or asking tough questions about officiating directives, most sports talk shows leaned into the drama between the players. Wilson versus Boston, Hammon versus the refs, the Aces versus the so-called scrappy Fever. The bigger systemic question, why the rules of engagement seemed to flip mid-series, barely registered in the mainstream debate. For the WNBA's business office, that was almost the perfect outcome. The controversy kept people talking about the games, not the governance behind them. Ratings climbed going into the deciding Game 5, social media engagement spiked, and the league successfully turned what could have been an officiating scandal into a marketing bonanza.
But for many longtime fans, the episode left a sour aftertaste. Forums that had once been focused purely on matchups and tactics now buzzed with skepticism. If they can change the tone of officiating overnight for a ratings boost, what else can they tweak? Some argued that every league adjusts officiating in subtle ways to protect stars or encourage certain styles of play. Others worried that the integrity of the playoffs had been compromised for the sake of a narrative arc.
That tension between basketball as pure competition and basketball as curated entertainment became the lasting legacy of the so-called special whistle game. It forced fans to ask a question bigger than any single series. How much of the drama we celebrate in sports is organic, and how much is quietly steered by unseen hands trying to shape a better story for TV? When you step back and look at the entire arc of this story, it's easy to see why one offhand remark from A'ja Wilson refused to disappear. She thought she was pointing out a single night of bad officiating. Instead, she drew attention to an invisible shift that changed the course of a playoff series, and for a lot of fans, changed the way they looked at the league itself. The free throw disparity, the sudden change in how contact was judged, the body language on the Aces sideline, and the explosion of online debate all combine into a picture that feels bigger than basketball. It's a reminder that every professional sport is also a televised product, and sometimes the lines between fair competition and made-for-TV drama can blur in ways no player sees coming. Wilson's so-called meltdown no longer looks like a temper tantrum when viewed in context. It looks like the reaction of an athlete who sensed the rules of the game shifting beneath her feet, but couldn't say so outright without facing fines, ridicule, and accusations of making excuses. In trying to defend herself, she accidentally revealed the larger machine at work, a machine designed to keep audiences hooked, even if it meant upsetting the balance of the contest. That's the uncomfortable truth that lingers long after the box score fades. The whistle in Game 4 really was special, just not for the reason Wilson thought. It wasn't about favoritism toward Aaliyah Boston or a conspiracy against Las Vegas. It was about the quiet removal of an advantage the Aces had enjoyed all series, timed perfectly to create a fresh headline and one more night of must-see basketball. So the question isn't just who deserved to win that night. The bigger question is what we as fans want the future of the sport to look like. Should the league lean into drama to grow the game? Or should it draw a hard line to keep the playoffs sacred no matter what the ratings say? Drop your take in the comments. Was the special whistle a clever business move that saved the series, or a dangerous step that chips away at the sport's credibility? If you think there's always more beneath the headlines, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. And share this story with the friend who always swears the games are scripted, because at least this time, they might not be entirely wrong.